Hey, and welcome to our Friday video this week. So this week we're talking about behavioral economics, which I started introducing on Wednesday. It's a subfield of economics that has kind of branched out, reaching to psychology and drawing insights from psychology research to help us better understand how people actually make decisions in their daily lives. The classic economic models do a good job with a lot of things. Even though people don't think in terms of utility functions and budget constraints, they act as if they did because we are thinking about, well, I have limited resources and I want to get the stuff that makes us most happy. But there are situations where people are systematically acting in ways that does not fit with the classic economic models. And so behavioral economics studies those deviations from rational behavior, and if they're systematic, then we can say things about them and predict how people will act in ways that differ from the classic models. So what I'll do today is just talk about a few kind of areas of decision making, specifically about consumer choice, what we're talking about, that behavioral has helped provide insights into. There's a much deeper, richer literature, as with most things we talk about in a principles class. This is a rabbit hole we could go down and spend a lot of time on, but we'll just kind of skim over the surface of it. So when people are thinking about the stuff that they want to buy, as we've talked about with budget constraints, we're often not thinking about in terms of total income that someone has. We're taking out taxes and some other non-discretionary stuff first. So how much money do they actually have to work with when they're choosing what to buy, right? And sometimes we even get more specific. We say, well, the family kind of has a entertainment budget. And so we look at something like concert tickets and vacation trips. So we're not looking at their food budget, their housing budget. We've kind of set all of those things aside. One thing that the classic economic models assume is that it's fine for us to do that, but we have to allow people to transfer money between the different household budgets. So you may have a food budget, a housing budget, a clothes budget, and an entertainment budget. But you need to be able to transfer dollars between them in a way that you get the most bang for your buck. So if you really need to move more money to your food budget because you've developed some taste for Haagen-Dazs ice cream and it's pretty expensive, and you'll get a lot of bang for your buck, a lot of happiness for your dollars by buying more Haagen-Dazs ice cream. Well, classic economic models assume that we can take some money from our clothing budget and put it into our food budget. If we know we're going to get more bang for the buck, that's what we will do. Not just that we can do it, but we will do it. So an insight from behavioral is that people are quite reluctant when they've kind of created those different categories in their budget. Money is not totally fungible between them. So that means a dollar is not a dollar is not a dollar. Instead, people think in terms of, well, this is a food dollar, right? That goes to my food budget, and I'm going to kind of keep it that way. This is my clothing budget. Ooh, I didn't buy much last month in my clothing budget. That means I have extra money in my clothing budget this month. You're keeping those dollars kind of separate. That's how most people think when they're thinking about their budgets. And that has some ramifications for the assumptions that we make when it comes to the classic models. Because we are going to assume that you transfer money between your budgets so that you're always getting the most bang for the buck. Turns out people don't do that. They may actually get more bang for the buck from their food budget because, excuse me, because of that Haagen-Dazs ice cream craving that they have than they do from their clothing budget this month. That doesn't mean they're going to transfer money from their clothing budget to their food budget, so we should think about that when we're predicting how people will act when there's a change in income or changes in prices like we've talked about. So that's about fungibility of money. There's also things like something called an endowment effect. So classic models assume that when you place a value on something, you're looking at a pear in the grocery store and you say, that pear would be worth $1 for me. I would get that much enjoyment out of it. we assume that you would also be willing to sell a pair for that same value. So you would say, yeah, if you're willing to pay $1 for a pair, you would also be willing to sell a pair for $1. Why? Because at $1 willingness to pay, we would say you're indifferent between buying it or not. That means you would also be indifferent between selling a pair that you have and not selling it. So we call it willingness to pay when you're looking to buy something. When you're looking to sell something, we call that willingness to accept. How much money does someone have to offer you for you to accept the deal and sell them the pair or whatever it is? Behavioral economics has found that people have very systematic differences in their willingness to pay and their willingness to accept. We call it the endowment effect. You endow people with goods and all of a sudden they're going to demand a higher amount of money to sell it than they would be willing to pay to buy it in the first place. So it's a puzzle from the classic models because we assume willingness to pay and willingness to accept would be the same because there's that point of indifference. The endowment effect says there's actually something special about getting something, maybe holding it in your hands. Famous example was done with an experiment where students in a classroom like ours were given coffee mugs. So half of them were given coffee mugs and were asked, what would it take for you to sell this coffee mug? And other ones were asked how much they would be willing to pay to buy one of the coffee mugs, and there's this big difference. And it wasn't just across students. If you randomly assign students, then you would think that you would end up with groups that are pretty balanced. But even the same person, if you ask them what they're willing to pay to buy a coffee mug, but then you say, well, here's one, how much would you be willing to accept to be able to sell it? They end up saying a higher number for willingness to accept than willingness to pay. So that's the endowment effect. That's another puzzle that it matters a lot of times in the predictions we make about how people are going to act. Now, most people aren't selling stuff all the time, but actually it's become much more common with things like eBay and Amazon that it is easy to have a little side business selling stuff. And so thinking about how that works with the endowment effect is an important thing that behavioral economists study. So one last one I'll mention is we talked already about how people think about time a little differently than classic models would predict when it comes to discounting the future. People put a big premium on the now or the near future compared to something that's going to happen later. There's another aspect of thinking about not time but different possible outcomes. So this is relevant during a time like a pandemic. So there's this idea that more salient events are the ones that people factor in a lot when they're making a decision. So salience is this idea that something comes easily to the top of your mind. That's a salient event. And so if you just saw something on TV, that would be really salient to you. Maybe you saw riots on TV, and so riots are a salient event for you at the moment. So behavioral has found that people put a lot of weight on things that are kind of recent in their mind, whether they lived it or saw it, were exposed to it in some way, heard a story from a friend. Those salient events take on a huge role. And so we see this with COVID-19. You can tell people the probabilities of, say, getting seriously sick given that you have COVID. If you've contracted COVID-19, what is the probability that you get seriously sick and have to go to the hospital, get put on supplemental oxygen, maybe put on a vent? You can tell people that probability. You can tell them the probability that they'll get so sick that they actually die from it, right? We have some idea. We don't know exactly what these numbers are, but we have some idea of what those probabilities are. If someone has a family member or a friend who has gotten COVID-19 and got really sick from it, people put a lot of weight on that. So that's where we see people really saying, whoa, this is a serious disease. I know someone who has gotten sick and had to go to the hospital or maybe even passed away from it. So when it happens to someone you know, then it's salient. Now, the classic economic models say, we should be updating with the best information we have. And so actually, the stuff coming out of the medical literature about what the probabilities are, that's by and large much more complete, much more accurate information about how we should be thinking about how dangerous this disease is. But that's not how people actually think. They think about what's salient to them, and that tends to lead their risk beliefs in a much bigger way. They do some combination of the two, but people put a lot of weight on salient events. So all of those are some examples of decisions people make that behavioral helps us understand better. Why? Because people don't act perfectly according to our rational models. And I'll just mention in closing that behavioral economics has kind of gone hand in hand with experimental economics, this idea that we can conduct experiments about how people act and make decisions. That'll help us understand what's going on in their heads a little better. By doing experiments, we can randomize and use control groups and draw from psychology and other sciences about how we conduct things. That can lead to new insights, let us look at some important questions. But so even in this little overview, I've mentioned some of the famous experiments within behavioral. I really enjoy experiments, so that's part of my research agenda and some of the stuff that I do. So if you're interested in this stuff, let me know. I'm happy to point you toward more literature, and if you're looking to get involved in research, there may even be ways to do that. So thank you. Hope everyone has a great weekend. I'll talk to you later.